Okay, Tov. So we begin the seventh parak of Nedarim, Hanodim in a Yerek. So a person takes a neder that he won't have any benefit from a Yerek. And the word Yerek means something that has olive, it has leaves that grow from the ground. And therefore, mutar b'dluim. Dluim are pumpkins, and they don't have olive. They don't have those leaves. So this is the Shita of the Tanakama. And the Shita of the Tanakama is based on the fact that if you send a shliach to bring back Yerokos, and instead he buys and brings back Dluim, then he has not fulfilled his shlichus. But Rabbi Akiva Oser. Rabbi Akiva says that even Dluim, despite the fact that they don't grow these olive, these leaves, nevertheless, they are still considered in the Lashon B'nei Adam to be included under the general category called Yerek. Omrulo, so the Chachamim argue against Rabbi Akiva. Valo, what about the case of someone, Omer Adam L'shlucho, a man says to a shliach, Kachli Yerek, purchase from me Yerek. Vehu, and the shliach doesn't find any Yerokos in the marketplace. Omer lo matzasi ela dluim. He comes back and he says to the mishalech, look, I found that they're selling dluim. Should I buy the dluim? So from the fact that he would not purchase dluim without first getting the okay from the mishalech, the go ahead from the mishalech, that proves that dluim are not considered part of Yerek. Omalahem, and Rabbi Akiva responds to the argument of the Chachamim, Kain Hadova. You're correct that every premise that you assume is absolutely correct. The shliach would not buy Dluim, but he would go back to the Mishalech and say, look, I couldn't find Yerek, should I buy Dluim? Oshema Omer Hu Lo Matzasi El Kitnis. The very fact that the shliach goes back to the Mishalech to ask him, would you want me to buy Dluim? That itself proves that Dluim are included under Yerek. Mimakom Shabbos, from the very proof that you, the Chachamim, bring, I bring a proof to the opposite conclusion. If, let's say, the shliach would not find any Yerakos, and he didn't find any Dluim in the shuk, all he found was kidneos, he found legumes, would he go back to the Mishalech and say, well, should I buy legumes? Obviously not, because legumes are not Yerakos. It's a whole different category, a whole different species. Ella, but the reason why he does go back to the Mishalech to ask him if we should buy Dluim, Ishad Dluim B'chal Yerek. Kitnios Eina B'chal Yerek. So we have three levels over here. We have one level called Yerek, and that has olive, but we have a more generic understanding, according to Rabbi Akiva, of the word Yerek that would include even Dluim. But then you get to the level of Kitnios, and Kitnios is not Yerek at all. And the Mishalech would never expect to be asked a question by the Shliach, hey, buddy, I couldn't find any Yerakos, I couldn't find any Dluim, should I buy Kitnios? That would be a ridiculous question. We'll just complete the Mishnah because I have a comment to make here. The Asur B'Pula Mitzri. Now, Pula Mitzri divides up into two subcategories. There's Pula Mitzri that's Lach, and that's considered a Yerek because the olive, the leaves that grow from a Pula Mitzri, as long as the Pula Mitzri is still moist, are edible. But Mutar B'Yavish, but if the Pula Mitzri is already dried up, then those leaves that cover the pool are not edible anymore. They just throw them out. So that would mean that Pula Mitzri Yavesh is not considered a Yerek. There's no possibility of eating the olive, and therefore it's mutar in a case of Hamudar Min HaYerek. Now, this whole discussion in the Mishnah about whether the Shliach will go back and ask the Mishalech in the event that he couldn't find X, should I buy Y? And the Mishnah differentiates between kitnios, where the Mishalech obviously left out kitnios, he said Yerakos, as opposed to the case of Deluin, which is a little bit more the gray area, and maybe Deluin wouldn't be included on the Yerakos. The Chachamim say that no, Deluin are not included on the Yerakos, and they bring a proof from the fact that the Shliach would not, al das atzmo, bring Deluim. He would have to get the okay from the Mishalech, whereas Rabbi Kiva says, well, the very fact that the Shliach is, so to speak, obligated to ask the Mishalech, should I bring back Deluim? That proves that Deluim does come under the category, or perhaps the expanded category of Yerakos. What is this whole business about the Shliach? So obviously, and this is not a chidush, when we discuss the Mishalech and the Shliach, we're talking about Lashon B'nai Adam. We want to know what people mean when they use certain terms. But perhaps we could go even one step further. And we could say that what the Mishnah is addressing in terms of Shlichus is the obligation of the Shliach. What is the scope, the extent of the obligation of a Shliach? Does he have a right to say at one point, I have no obligation at all, I didn't find what you asked me to find, I can't bring back what you asked me to bring back, and therefore my shlichus basically is terminated? Or do we say no? He's obligated to ask the Mishalech within the purview of his shlichus. And in my humble opinion, what that seems to imply is that shlichus is a mitzvah. When a person takes upon himself to be a shliach, it's not just some sort of a contractual agreement. It's much more than that. It's a mitzvah. For example, the Gemara tells us in Masechet Yomi that the shliach who was sent to the midbar with the Sayer, the Shar Mishalech, he has to go back to the Mishalech and tell the Mishalech, the Kohen Gadol, that he fulfilled his shlichus. And that's called Shliach Chozer Eitzel Mishalcho. He has to go back to the Mishalech. Or, for example, the Gemara in Kiddushin speaks about a case of a Shliach who decides to marry this girl for himself as opposed to the Mishalech. The Gemara says that he violates his commitment of shlichus. He took upon himself to marry this Rivka on behalf of Reuven, and he, Shimon himself, wants to be Makadisha. And that's a violation of his commitment. So we see, I think, that shlichus is much more than just a technicality. It's a chova. It comes under the mitzvah of the Ahavta L'Reacha Kamocha. You made a commitment to someone, and you have to live up to that commitment. And here we have machlokas between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Akiva. They both agree that the shliach at first stop cannot buy Deluim when he was sent to buy Yerakos. He's got to go back to the shaliach to ask for permission and to know whether he fulfills his shlichus if he brings back Deluim. The Rabbanan understand from that he's not committed to bring back Deluim. He wants to be Makayim his mitzvah, and therefore, within the purview of the mitzvah, he has to go back to the Shalech to clarify, but it's not part of his original shlichus. Whereas Rabbi Akiva understood that the very fact that he's obligated to go back to the Shalech and question whether or not Deluim could be a fulfillment of his obligation, that too is part of the very essential obligation of his shlichus when he was sent to buy Yerakos. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva concludes from this halacha that Deluim are included on the Yerakos. The Gemara immediately raises the following issue. I know Demina Yerek Mutar B'Deluim Rabbi Akiva Oser V'Hamin Yerek. No, I don't understand, says the Gemara. How could Rabbi Akiva expand the definition of Yerek to include even Deluim? Deluim is a peri, but it's not what we call Pri Hadama. Pri Hadama includes that which has olim, and in the case of Deluim, it's like a fruit. You buy an orange, or a pear or an apple, whatever you buy. You don't eat the leaves. That's called a peri. Yerakos, on the other hand, is what we call pre-hadama, right? We go to Masechet brachas and we make in the Mishnah, we make a bracha of Bori pre-hadama on Yerakos because of the olim. So how could Rabbi Akiva say that because the shliach goes back to the shalech to ask him, should I bring you dluim, that makes it into a pri-adama? Maybe within the purview of shlichus, the shliach is morally obligated to do his best to try to satisfy the desire of the mishalech, but it doesn't change the status of a pri to make it into a pri-adama. Omar Ula says Einochinami. The premise of your objection is absolutely correct. And we're going to have to reinterpret the Mishnah and expand the language, the formulation of the Mishalech. The Mishalech didn't just say to him, bring me a yerek, but rather be Omer, Yarke Kidera Olai. He adds extra words here. He adds Kidera, Yarke Kidera. The Konam was Yarke Kidera. That's where Rabbi Akiva says that as a result of the fact that he added to his formulation of the neder, we're going to interpret that to mean that he's coming to expand the definition of a yerek to include anything that's not eaten raw. For example, deluyim. You don't eat a raw pumpkin, you cook it. And Rabbi Akiva shows that within the generic term yerek, even deluyim are called yerakos in the language of Bnei Adam. So the Gemara says, okay, he said yarke kedera, but yarke kedera means a yerek hanechal b'kedera kama. Dilma, perhaps, when he adds the word kedera, what he really means to refer to are certain kinds of, shall we call them, yerakos, which are added to the kedera, not because you want to eat the yerakos, but because they add a taste to the pot, to the food that you're cooking. For example, shumin, garlic, or bitzolim, or onions. It's not that you added them because you want to eat them as such, but because they give a taste to the kedera. And that's why he added yarke kedera, to make sure to include under yerakos even those yerakos that are not eaten per se, but rather are eaten because they add a taste to the kedera. So the Gemara says, you know, you're right. We're going to have to expand the formulation of his neder. Be omer yerek hamizbashel b'kedera olai. Any yerek that will be cooked and cannot be eaten raw, even though it doesn't necessarily add any taste to the kedera, that's also considered misbashel b'kedera, and therefore we're going to expand and include deluyim. So the Gemara asks, why does Rabbi Akiva disagree with the Rabbanan? What did the Rabbanan say? What was the underlying principle of the Rabbanan that bothered Rabbi Akiva? Rabbanan sabri kol milsa ditzarach shlichul imluchei Allah. If we are obligating the shliach to go back to the mishalech within the purview of the mitzvah of shlichus, and ask the mishalech if he wants this instead of that, is lav mino. The very fact that he has to go back and get the okay and the permission of the mishalech indicates that it wasn't included in the min, in the category of that which he was sent for. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Soba called milsa de mimlech shlicha lo minehu. The very fact that the shliach has to go back to the mishalech to ask if this is within the parameters of the shlichus, that proves that minahu, that it's included in the same min. Because, for example, Rabbi Akiva would argue, would the shliach have to go back to the shalech and ask him about kidneys? That's certainly not mimina yirakos. But the fact that you, Rabbanan, agree to me, to Rabbi Akiva, that the shliach has to go back and ask, I didn't find yirakos, can I bring back dluim? That proves that dluim is considered mimin Hayirokos. Amar Abaye. Abaye says that, you know what? Even though Rabbi Akiva prohibits the noder from noder ben Yerek to eat tuluim, he doesn't get malchus for violating the law of Bal Yachal Dvar. And here we have three approaches, three interpretations of Abaye. We'll start with the Ran. The Ran interprets it that it still remains a suffix. We don't know for sure that tuluim, even according to Rabbi Akiva, are included on the Yerek. Rabbi Akiva is going to be machmir in Hilchas Nedarim because of Safek Neder L'chumra, and he's going to assume L'chumra that even Duluim are included on the Yerek, but it still remains a Safek, and therefore we cannot give him Malchus. However, the Shita Mekubetzes has a different approach, and he says the following, that although we interpret the Lashon B'nai Adam according to Rabbi Akiva of Yerek to include even Tuluim, however, the Noder has the right to say that he didn't mean Tuluim. When he took his Neder, he meant Yerakos that have Olim to the exclusion of Tuluim. And even though Bal Yachal Dvar will apply here, and he violates the law of his neder because the Lashon B'nai Adam, according to Rabbi Akiva, Dluim are included under the general category of Yerakos, but nevertheless, we have what's called a Hasra Safek. Hasra Safek means that one of the conditions for imposing Malchus on a person is that the Hasra has to be crystal clear. And here the Hasra is not crystal clear, because in the mind of the Noder, of the Musra, he thinks that this Hasra is not a real Hasra. It's not valid because Dluim, he didn't have in mind Dluim when he took the Neder for Yerakos. So even though, again, on the level of Bal Yachal, he violates Bal Yachal, but nevertheless, we can't give him Malchus for a technical reason, and that is we're lacking Hasra Zvad. However, this Gemara appears elsewhere in Shas, in the Masechet Chulin, on Daf Kuf Daled, and there Tosfos reinterprets this statement of Abaye. Abaye is arguing that Rabbi Akiva agrees that Dluim is not really part of Yerakos, and the Neder on a Doraisa level is not Chal. Rabbi Akiva was generating what we call an Iser Neder D'Rabbanan. The Rabbanan were Machmir, and they said since Duluim could be considered part of Yerakos, we can't take the luxury of allowing him to eat Duluim because he might mistakenly think that the Rabbanan are allowing him to violate his neder. And therefore, when Rabbi says that when you're Malchus ain't a loka, he means Malchus Doraisa, because the entire Iser of Rabbi Akiva regarding Duluim is all Rabbanan. Tanan Hasam. Now we're going to study a Mishnah Me'ila, and we're going to present the thesis of Rav Chizda in analyzing who is the author of this Mishnah. Now, in the laws of Me'ila, when a Baal Bayis sends a shliach and mistakenly tells him to do an action of shimush al chol, in that which is hegdesh, but he didn't know it was hegdesh, he thought it was chol, it was chulin. So this is all a case of shogeg. Now the question is, who is the moel? Who's chay of the korban me'ilah for being moel in hegdesh? Is it the mishaleach or the shliach? And the Mishnah says it depends. Hashliach shasa shlichuso. If the shliach did not deviate at all from his shlichus, he fulfilled his shlichus exactly as he was commanded to do so. He fulfilled his mission in the way that the Baal Bayis wanted him to fulfill the mission. Is then he's just the extended arm of the Baal Bayis, and the moel here is the Baal Bayis. The shliach is acting on behalf of the Baal Bayis, not on his own behalf, and therefore it's the Baal Bayis who is chayiv the korban me'ilah. And even though we have a principle in Kol Torah Kula, Ein Shliach L'Dvar Avera, but Me'ilah is the exception. And the Gemara in the second chapter of Kiddushin establishes that with regard to Me'ilah, we have a special parsha that Yesh Shliach L'Dvar Avera. However, if the Shliach deviates from the Shlichus, Lo Asa Shlichuso, and we'll see the example in a minute, is Shliach Moel. Moel. Now the Shliach is Osal das Atzmo, and he's not acting within the purview of Shlichus, and therefore he is the Moel, and he brings the Korban Milah. Says Rav Chisda, Mantana, or Rav Chisda Masnisin to Lo Rabbi Akiva. That Mishnah in Me'ilah is against Rabbi Akiva, and the Gemara later on is going to identify which Tana, and that's Rav Shimon Gamliel, but that's later on, is the Bar Pluta of Rabbi Akiva. Now, how does Rav Chisda know that that Mishnah is not Rabbi Akiva? And the answer is that we have to read the next part of that Mishnah, the Sefer of that Mishnah, the Snan Ketzai. What is, asks the Mishnah, the case in which the Shliach deviated from the Shlichus of the Baal Bayis, and therefore the Shliach is Moel? And we're talking about a Baal Bayis who had basar and kaved of hegdish. He had meat, flesh, the regular meat, and he had liver. And again, the Baal Bayis mistakenly thought that this was chulin, but really it's hegdish. Omar lo, he says to the shliach, "Ein basar li'orchim." I want you to take the basar, and only the basar, and feed it to the orchim, thinking again that it was chulin. And what did the shliach do? He deviated the nasal and kaved, and he gave them the liver of hegdish, but not the basar of hegdish. Or in the flip case, the Mashalech said to the shliach, "Tein kaved li'orchim v'nasal and basar hashliach ma." And the basic principle that underlies this Mishnah is that kaved is not considered part of basar. Now, wait a second. Let's go back to Rabbi Akiva's litmus test, namely that if the Mishalech sent him and he couldn't find exactly that, would he still have to go back to the Mishalech and ask him, well, what about this? And Rabbi Akiva says the fact that he has to go back to the Mishalech and ask him, what about this, proves that that is also min. The Rabbi Akiva, Amar Rabbi Akiva called Milsa, the Mimlech Allah Shliach Minehu, it's part of the same min. So if the Shliach was sent to purchase basar, and he didn't find basar, he didn't find steaks, he didn't find roast, instead he found liver, he goes back to the Baal Bayis and say, well, would you want liver? That's what I found in the shuk. Is limo Baal Bayis below limo shliach? According to Rabbi Akiva, the shliach fulfilled the shlichus by purchasing and bringing back kaved, because he have to ask the Mishalech, would you want kaved? So therefore concludes Rav Chisda that this Mishnah in Me'ilah, which says that according, if the Mishalech sent him to buy basar and instead, or to feed the orchim basar, and instead the shliach fed the orchim kaved, then the shliach is a moel because it's outside and a violation of the purview of his shlichus. According to Rabbi Akiva, kaved is considered under basar. Or Abaye, now the truth is that even before Abaye, if you don't mind, this is just for my own fun, I can anticipate how the Gemara would reject Rav Chisda. True, Rabbi Akiva says that if he was sent to purchase basar and he didn't find basar, he'd have to go back to the Mishalech and ask about kaved. But would he be a shliach if he didn't even go back to the Baal Bayis? But he decided on his own initiative that he's going to bring back kaved. Rabbi Akiva doesn't say that basar and kaved are one and the same. Rabbi Akiva says that within the broader context of basar, kaved could be considered basar, but that's only if it's crystal clear that the Baal Bayis who sent him to buy basar would be happy and satisfied with kaved. Amar Abaye afilu temer Rabbi Akiva. This Mishnah in Me'ilah could reflect the shita of Rabbi Akiva. And here we're going to turn to Amid Beis.